The first rays of dawn gently kissed the horizon over the ancient land of Egypt. The world was still cloaked in the deep shadows of night, and yet, beneath the silence of the early hours, something stirred. Slowly, like the quiet unraveling of a mystery, the marketplace began to take shape. It was a place both alive with promise and filled with the unmistakable whispers of intrigue. In the distance, you could hear the faint rustle of fabrics being laid out, the creak of wooden carts being wheeled into place, and the soft murmur of traders preparing for the day ahead. The air, thick with the scent of fresh earth, mingled with the fragrance of spices and oils as the first merchants began to unpack their wares. Slowly, the once quiet square began to fill with movement, the hasty steps of those who knew that the first hours of the day held secrets the light would soon expose. For here, in the half-light of dawn, deals were struck in hushed tones beneath the surface of the market's more visible hustle. It was in these early moments that the true power of the Egyptian marketplace would unfold, hidden in plain sight. Here, fortunes were made, lost, and most often, manipulated. The smell of grain filled the air, carried by the winds from the fertile banks of the Nile. Papyrus, carefully pressed into sheets, lay stacked in neat rows, waiting to be sold to the scholars and scribes who would later fill the market's arteries with their ink-stained fingers. Precious metals, gold and silver, glimmered softly, their luster barely catching the first light of day. Perfumed oils, their delicate vials held in the hands of merchants who understood the value of presentation, promised a future that shimmered as brightly as their contents. The marketplace in ancient Egypt was far more than just a place of exchange. It was a battleground of influence, where every transaction carried with it the weight of something greater than goods. But even before the first full light broke across the city, something else lingered in the air, a quiet, unspoken sense that there were forces at play in the shadows of these stalls. Beneath the banter of merchants and the soft shuffle of feet, there were whispered deals, half-completed bargains, and promises made in the dark corners of the market. For all its vibrancy, there was something unsettling about the market at dawn. It was not just a place where goods were exchanged. It was where Egypt's power, its very lifeblood, was negotiated. The market was where the fate of the kingdom was sealed, often before the common folk ever saw a penny change hands. It was in these early moments, when the sun had not yet fully risen, that deals were struck in ways the public could never imagine. The market was an arena for more than just trade. It was a space where Egypt's elite gathered, where merchants and traders could find themselves caught in webs of politics, manipulation, and, at times, deception. The ordinary traders peddled their goods in the open, hoping for fair prices and willing buyers. But there were others, those who lurked in the darker corners of the square. They knew that power often lay not in the goods themselves, but in the control of the flow of goods. The market was a place of high stakes. It was not simply the exchange of grain for silver or papyrus for trade. It was a microcosm of Egyptian society complex, layered and filled with hidden currents of influence. As the market began to fill with more merchants, the air grew heavier with the sounds of the first true activity of the day. The clinking of coins, the bartering, the haggling. It was a familiar rhythm, yet one that held far more significance than most could understand. Every transaction carried weight. Every word spoken between a merchant and a buyer was fraught with hidden meaning. And in the stillness of those early hours, when only the most aware traders and buyers gathered, the market revealed its true purpose. It was where the real power of Egypt began, and just as quickly as it had begun, the first rays of sunlight began to break through the horizon, painting the market in a light that was both revealing and deceiving. The place that had been filled with whispered secrets and half-spoken promises was now bathed in the full light of day. Yet, for those who knew how to look, the real bargains and secrets were hidden beneath the public facade, waiting for the right moment to resurface. As the sun rose and the marketplace came alive with the bustle of day, the true nature of Egypt's commerce would begin to unfold. In the next moments, the goods, the people, and the trades would reveal the origins of Egypt's market system, the unspoken rules and systems that allowed power to pass from hand to hand, hidden in plain sight. Beneath the surface of ancient Egypt's bustling marketplace lay an intricate system of trade, one not defined simply by the exchange of goods, but by the strategic flow of power, politics, and influence. The goods sold in the market, seemingly ordinary to the untrained eye, were woven into the fabric of Egypt's empire, shaping its very economic and social structures. At the heart of this economy were a handful of crucial commodities: grain, papyrus, and precious metals. These items were more than just traded goods. They were the lifeblood of Egypt's vast and powerful empire. Grain, the foundation of Egypt's agricultural wealth, was as valuable as gold, for it fed not just the people, but the pharaoh's soldiers and the growing needs of the empire. Papyrus, too, played an essential role not only in commerce, but in the exchange of knowledge, preserving Egypt's history, laws, and scientific advancements. And then there were the precious metals, gold and silver, which not only served as currency but as a symbol of Egypt's wealth and power. These commodities, flowing through the marketplace like currents in the Nile, were essential to Egypt's grip on the known world. But what if the value of these goods was more than just about their worth? What if these items, so seemingly ordinary, were imbued with a deeper power, one that shaped not only Egypt's economy, but its very structure? As the sun cast its first light on the market, the truth became clearer. Behind the scenes of legitimate trade, a darker economy was at play. For in the shadows of the marketplace, power was not merely exchanged in the form of goods, but in manipulation, secrecy, and hidden agendas. The market was not just a space for honest barter. There were those who saw opportunities to turn the tide in their favor: middlemen, for example, who would artificially inflate the prices of essential goods. A merchant might promise a seller a fair price for grain, only to hoard it in secret, waiting for a time of scarcity when he could drive the price sky high, cornering the market and profiting off the desperation of others. There was little trust between the traders and the buyers, as each one was aware of the silent games being played behind their backs. Some would use their intimate knowledge of supply and demand to manipulate the market to their advantage, ensuring that the flow of goods would never match the demand at the right time. It was a market where prices were anything but fixed, where bargains were born of hidden agendas and subtle deceits. Even more disturbing was the way in which these manipulations became commonplace. Traders learned to work within this grey area of ethics, pushing the boundaries of trust and fairness to maximize their profits. The savvy trader understood that the game was not about trading commodities, it was about controlling the very flow of those commodities. In this space, value was not just a matter of goods exchanged, it was a measure of power. And power, once gained, had a strange way of perpetuating itself. Those who had control over the flow of goods also held power over those who depended on them. A single deal could reshape not only the economic landscape, but the power structure of the market itself. Yet, even with all these manipulations, there were deeper layers of secrecy. Traders would sometimes work in collusion, joining forces to hoard goods or share inside knowledge, all while presenting themselves as rivals in the public eye. The marketplace, with all its public grandeur, was a facade, a carefully orchestrated performance, where the actors were often playing roles that were entirely different from what they appeared to be. And while the public bartered and exchanged in plain view, much of the real business was conducted in the shadows, away from the prying eyes of the crowd. In all this, it wasn't just the men who ruled the market. There were women, too often relegated to the background, yet essential to the very structure of Egypt's commerce. Women were often responsible for the selling of spices, cloth, and cosmetics items, which, while not as glamorous as grain or precious metals, held their own in value. Women in Egypt were not merely bystanders in the economic game. They engaged in trade, sometimes making deals in the quiet corners of the market, where their influence often went unnoticed by the wider world. They knew that in the marketplace, everyone had a part to play, and those who could navigate its hidden layers with grace and cunning could command a power of their own. As the sun climbed higher in the sky and the market became more vibrant. The shadows that once held, the darker transactions began to fade, but the influence of these hidden dealings remained. The bargains made behind closed stalls, the inflated prices, and the secretive collusions did not disappear as the day progressed. In fact, they would only grow stronger, weaving into the very fabric of Egyptian society. What happened in the early hours of the day set the stage for everything that followed. The marketplace wasn't just about selling goods, it was about selling power, about controlling the flow of resources, and about positioning oneself within a system where everything, every good, every service, every relationship was part of a much larger game. And so, as the sun rose fully, the market blossomed into a cacophony of sound and colour, with traders shouting their prices and buyers haggling in the heat of the moment. But the true stories, the ones that shaped the empire, lay beneath the surface. The game was far from over. In fact, it was only just beginning. And as we step deeper into this world, we'll discover how these seemingly small manipulations created the foundation for Egypt's power, and how they ultimately led to the rise and fall of fortunes within the marketplace, just as they still do today. The sun hung low over the horizon, casting long shadows across the bustling marketplace. Yet beneath the hum of public exchange and the clamour of bargaining voices, a much quieter, more powerful force was at play. It was not the open exchanges between buyers and sellers that shaped Egypt's economy, it was the unseen hands that quietly manipulated the flow of goods, dictating prices and deciding who would thrive and who would fall. These were the masters of the market, the traders, merchants, and middlemen who operated behind the scenes, pulling the strings of Egypt's economy with calculated precision. They were not the ones who hawked wares in the open air. No, their power lay in the subtlety of their movements, the influence they held over the lives of those who never knew their names. Some were loyal to the pharaohs, operating within the structures of power, using their wealth to secure positions of influence. Others, however, played a more dangerous game, building their empires not by open allegiance, but by cultivating monopolies, manipulating trade routes, and orchestrating the complex web of supply and demand to their advantage. They were the gatekeepers of Egypt's wealth, controlling what flowed into the market and what was kept hidden from the public eye. At the heart of this market network was the barter system, an ancient form of trade where the value of goods was not fixed by currency but by the relationships between individuals. The value of grain, for example, was not simply in the grain itself, but in the status of the person trading it. A high-ranking merchant might exchange grain for papyrus, but the value of that exchange was influenced not just by the amount of goods being traded, but by the power dynamics at play. The merchants who controlled the grain trade wielded immense power, but so did those who controlled the flow of luxury goods like perfume, precious metals, or fine linens. In this world, the weight of a single transaction could shift the balance of power within Egypt, and those who had the ability to control these transactions became the true masters of Egypt's markets. Some of these traders worked openly, their names known to all. They were the ones who controlled the larger trade routes, operating with the blessing of the pharaohs, feeding the empire's needs with grain from the fertile banks of the Nile, papyrus from the lush fields along the river, and precious metals mined from Egypt's deserts. These traders made their fortunes by securing exclusive rights to certain goods and securing their place in the intricate web of Egypt's economy. But there were others, those who worked in the shadows, whose influence stretched far beyond what could be seen. They were the masters of manipulation, the ones who controlled the ebb and flow of commodities, using secrecy, alliances, and strategic knowledge to gain power and wealth. They were the ones who set prices, not by what was fair, but by what they could get away with. One such figure was the merchant who controlled the papyrus trade. By the time the market began to stir with early morning activity, he had already made his deals, securing large shipments of the precious scrolls that would fuel Egypt's bureaucracy. Papyrus, though seemingly mundane, was a commodity steeped in power. It was not just used for writing, it was used to document laws, transactions, and decrees. The scribes, those who could read and write, were the gatekeepers of knowledge, and their tools were often controlled by those who could wield power over the supply of papyrus. This merchant understood the value of his goods and the value of those who controlled the ability to purchase them. He would not simply sell papyrus to the highest bidder. Instead, he would decide who had access, creating a market where the very flow of knowledge could be manipulated. But it was not just papyrus that was controlled. Grain, the very foundation of Egypt's economy, was another commodity that lay in the hands of a select few. There were merchants who owned vast swaths of farmland, producing more grain than they could possibly consume. They used their influence to ensure that grain was scarce in certain areas, driving up its price and forcing the farmers to sell at whatever price the merchant demanded. Even more powerfully, these merchants used their grain holdings as leverage in political dealings, offering pharaohs and other high-ranking officials the chance to control the food supply in exchange for favors or protection. In this way, the marketplace was not just a place for economic exchange, it was a theater of power, where every trade, every transaction could alter the very fabric of Egypt's society. These merchants, often acting alone but sometimes in concert with others, were able to control Egypt's economy in ways that few could understand. They held the keys to the kingdom not in the form of an army or a throne, but in the flow of goods that made Egypt run. The manipulation of trade routes was another tool in their arsenal. By controlling the access to vital resources, they could decide who would prosper and who would falter. A single act of cutting off a trade route could cripple entire regions, forcing them to depend on the traders who had the power to supply them. These traders operated not just in the market, but in the political realm as well, knowing that wealth was not just about what one owned, it was about what one controlled. Some traders sought to build their wealth quietly, working through alliances and using their influence to rise in prominence. Others were more open in their approach, willing to take risks and challenge the status quo. These individuals did not just build their fortunes in the market, they shaped the market itself. They were the architects of Egypt's economy, and their power was rooted not just in the goods they traded, but in the very system they manipulated. In the end, the true masters of Egypt's markets were the ones who understood the game, those who could see beyond the surface of commerce and into the complex web of power, manipulation, and control. They were the ones who could move commodities in the dark of night, shaping the course of Egypt's history in ways that would be impossible to trace. And as they controlled the market, they also controlled Egypt's future, for the market was the very lifeblood of the empire. The question then remains, who were the true masters of Egypt's markets? Was it the pharaoh whose rule was publicly acknowledged, or was it the shadowy figures who moved behind the scenes, ensuring that Egypt's economy and its very power remained in their hands? As the morning sun rose higher, the market began to wake in full, its layers of hidden intrigue continuing to unfold. The next chapter of Egypt's marketplace would reveal the kinds of transactions that took place, the scams, the betrayals, the secret dealings that were the heartbeat of this mysterious economy. The story of Egypt's market was far from over, and as the sun climbed, the darker side of the economy would begin to reveal itself. The marketplace in ancient Egypt was a place of vibrant energy, where the exchange of goods was crucial to the kingdom's very survival. Yet beneath this outward display of commerce, there was another world, a world where deception thrived, and scams were not only common but expected. Here, trust was both a currency and a weapon. Traders, while appearing to engage in honest transactions, often weaved a web of lies and manipulation, exploiting the very system they depended on. It was a system where deceit had become so ingrained that it almost felt like a natural part of the market's rhythm. What if the deal you just made in the market wasn't as honest as you thought? What if everything you believed about the transaction was a carefully constructed illusion, designed to benefit the one who pulled the strings? At the heart of this world was the art of inflation. Merchants, masters of their craft, understood that the market was not just about what was exchanged, but about what could be made to appear valuable. Grain, Egypt's lifeblood, was often the target of such manipulation. A trader who controlled the grain could control the economy, and thus, the stakes were high. To inflate the price of grain, One could easily manipulate the scales, selling less for more. A slight adjustment in measurement, an inch here, a pinch there, and the buyer would never notice the difference. But it wasn't just grain that fell victim to these tactics. Luxury goods, often touted as rare and precious, were another playground for deceit. The rich and powerful sought items of beauty, gold, fine linen, perfumes, items that carried an air of exclusivity. But some merchants, aware of the desire for such goods, took advantage of the buyer's ignorance, creating counterfeit goods that looked every bit as real as the original. Fine linen might be stretched thin, and the gold might be a gilded base metal, but the buyer wouldn't know until it was too late. These acts of deception weren't isolated to the market stalls. They were entrenched in the very fabric of the trading system. Trust, once a foundational element of trade, had become a commodity that was easily bought and sold. Traders often used personal relationships to create an illusion of trust, gaining access to goods and people they would otherwise have never been able to manipulate. Friendships and alliances were forged, only to be shattered when the moment for betrayal arrived. A merchant might appear to offer a generous deal to a fellow trader, only to double-cross him later when it was time to settle up. These practices were not considered immoral by the traders, they were simply part of the game. The market was a high-stakes arena where only the shrewdest could survive, and the path to wealth was lined with the broken promises of those who fell victim to another's deception. The dark side of the marketplace was also home to a thriving black market, a shadowy realm where stolen goods found their way into the hands of eager buyers. Items taken from temples, royal estates, or even from other traders found their way onto the streets, sold in secret transactions that took place in the dead of night. What might have once been considered sacred or untouchable was suddenly transformed into just another commodity to be traded for profit. The black market flourished under the radar, unseen by the public eye but deeply embedded in the economic structure of Egypt. The thefts, though never fully acknowledged, were known to all. For many, the market was a place where rules were made to be broken, where the line between right and wrong became increasingly blurred. As these practices spread, they began to have a profound effect on the market's very nature. Traders who were once content to exchange goods for a fair price found themselves pressured to engage in these schemes in order to stay afloat. To compete in the world of high-stakes deals, one had to become a master of deception. The marketplace, which should have been a space for honest exchange, transformed into a battleground of wits and cunning. And for those who fell victim to the lies, the consequences were devastating. There were those who had their fortunes taken from them in a single transaction, their livelihoods destroyed by a carefully orchestrated scheme. The victims were often not just the buyers, but the traders themselves. To survive in the cutthroat world of ancient Egyptian commerce, one had to navigate the treacherous waters of deceit. A betrayal could come at any moment, and with it, the fall of an entire empire built on the trust between trader and buyer. Yet, in this world, such practices were accepted as normal. In fact, they were often seen as signs of skill, the ability to manipulate, to control the flow of goods, and to outwit others was a mark of success. The market became a breeding ground for corruption, where every deal was an opportunity for exploitation. No one was safe from the hands of those who knew how to manipulate the system. As the chapter draws to a close, the market, in all its vibrant chaos, presents itself as more than just a place for goods to be exchanged. It is a place where power is not simply held by the wealthy, but by those who can control the flow of goods, manipulate prices, and play the game of trust and betrayal. These hidden dealings, these undercurrents of deception, are not just a part of the marketplace, they are what make it work. And as we move deeper into the world of Egypt's economy, we will begin to understand how these secret deals, scams, and underhanded practices influenced not only the markets, but the very political landscape of Egypt itself. The marketplace, once a symbol of Egypt's prosperity, had become a place where the true power players were not those who traded openly, but those who moved in silence, making deals that would shape the future of Egypt's economy and empire. The market had become a reflection of Egypt itself, beautiful on the surface, but dark and full of secrets beneath. And as we explore the true mechanics of these hidden deals, we will begin to understand just how deep the manipulation ran and how it echoed through Egypt's political power structures, creating a system where only the most cunning could thrive. In the world of ancient Egypt, trade was not just a means of exchange, it was a source of power. At the heart of this commerce stood the pharaoh, whose dominion stretched across the land and whose influence could be felt in every corner of Egypt's markets. It was the pharaoh who oversaw the most essential goods, dictating the flow of grain, papyrus, and other luxury items. But beneath this monolithic figure was a far more complex web of power, one in which the pharaoh's control was often shared, shaped, and sometimes even overshadowed by those around him. These figures, some well-known, others more obscure, were the true masters of Egypt's market system, the ones who held sway over not just the goods, but the wealth and influence flowing through Egypt's veins. While the pharaoh was the figurehead, the true control of Egypt's trade network rested with a handful of powerful elites, priests, military officers, foreign diplomats, and high-ranking merchants. They were the ones who shaped Egypt's commerce, determining which goods would flourish and which would wither. These individuals had the means to control Egypt's trade routes, regulate imports and exports, and decide the fate of essential goods. The grain, that staple of life, was not just an agricultural product, it was a political tool. The pharaoh, of course, had final say, but those who controlled the grain trade had immense power over Egypt's people and, by extension, its political structure. Grain was so essential to Egypt's survival that controlling its flow could make or break the empire. Papyrus, that fragile but powerful medium of communication, was another key commodity. It was tied not only to Egypt's bureaucracy but to its very identity. The priests, with their vast religious and administrative influence, controlled the papyrus trade. They understood that to control papyrus was to control knowledge itself, and with knowledge came power. Scribes, the scholars of ancient Egypt, relied on papyrus to document everything from royal decrees to economic transactions. But just as in the grain trade, it wasn't enough to simply have access to the material. Those who controlled the papyrus supply had the ability to shape Egypt's destiny, preserving the pharaoh's decrees and history, while potentially stifling the voices of those with competing interests. The manipulation of papyrus was not just about paper, it was about the control of Egypt's narrative. However, it wasn't just internal power structures that governed Egypt's marketplace. Egypt's external trade relations also played a crucial role in shaping its economy. The Nile, Egypt's lifeblood, was the central trade route, but it was not the only one. Egypt's location at the crossroads of Africa and the Mediterranean made it a prime player in a web of international trade, connecting it with the Phoenicians, Nubians, and Greeks. These foreign powers brought exotic goods to Egypt, but they also brought new opportunities for manipulation. The Phoenicians, for example, were master traders, skilled in the art of navigating the seas and establishing trade networks. They brought much-needed timber, glass, and precious metals into Egypt. But their presence also introduced competition to the market. As Egypt's elite formed alliances with foreign traders, they gained access to goods that could shift the power balance, either by flooding the market or withholding supplies to drive prices up. The Nubians, to the south, offered another set of valuable goods: gold, ivory, and exotic animals that Egypt could not easily produce. Their trade opened doors to wealth, but also to tension. Egyptian merchants, often allied with the elite, would broker deals with the Nubians, sometimes in ways that were less than transparent. The profits from this trade, however, did not always reach the common people. Instead, they were funneled into the pockets of the elite, further consolidating their control over the economy. And then there were the Greeks. As Egypt entered the Hellenistic period, their influence became undeniable. The Greek traders brought a new set of goods, luxuries, intellectual ideas, and innovations that enriched Egypt's economy, but also destabilized its traditional market structure. The power dynamics were shifting, and the Egyptian elite, aware of these changes, sought to maintain their stranglehold on trade, sometimes at the expense of their own people. These power brokers were adept at manipulating the marketplace, ensuring that only a select few had access to the most valuable goods. As Egypt's empire expanded, the system of trade evolved, but the influence of these key figures remained constant. They were not just merchants, they were power players, wielding control over the lifeblood of Egypt's economy. The network of traders, priests, and military officers, working in tandem with foreign diplomats, created a carefully orchestrated system where power was not given freely. It was fought for, bargained for, and manipulated in every transaction. These figures held the power to make or break markets, to influence the course of Egypt's political future, and to dictate the flow of wealth that built Egypt's empire. But what of the common people, those who relied on the marketplace for their survival? For them, the game of trade was not about power, it was about necessity. The grain they needed to feed their families, the papyrus to write their names, the luxuries that symbolized their status, all of these were tied to the intricate network of power that was controlled by a few. The wealth of Egypt, for the majority, was a distant dream, one only realized by those who could maneuver through the complex system of power, manipulation, and control. As the sun rose higher and the market began to hum with life, the true nature of Egypt's economy came into sharper focus. The pharaoh, the priests, the military officers, the foreign traders, each held a piece of the puzzle. Yet the picture they created was one of inequality, of a system designed to serve the elite while the masses struggled to survive. These power brokers, though hidden from plain sight, shaped the very foundation of Egypt's marketplace, their influence stretching far beyond the borders of the market itself. As the market stirred to life, it became apparent that the true flow of goods was not just shaped by demand, it was shaped by the people who controlled that demand. The power of Egypt's trade lay not just in its goods, but in the hands of those who knew how to control them. The next section will explore the consequences of this intricate web of power, how it led to moments of crisis, and how manipulation and deceit would ultimately alter the course of Egypt's economic and political future. As the sun rose higher over the great Egyptian markets, the bustling activity that marked the start of each day masked the darker truths of what lay beneath. The marketplace was no longer just a space for commerce, it had become a battlefield of economics, a weapon wielded by the powerful to control both the flow of goods and the fate of the kingdom itself. Trade, which once helped build Egypt's wealth and power, was now manipulated to serve the whims of the elite, with devastating consequences for the common people. What was once a symbol of Egypt's prosperity became a tool for exploitation, with the prices of essential goods like grain and papyrus often inflated or hoarded to benefit the few at the expense of the many. During times of crisis, the market became a place of even darker machinations. The already fragile equilibrium of Egypt's economy, built on the flow of vital goods, was weaponized. Traders and merchants, knowing the desperation of the people, deliberately withheld supplies or inflated prices to turn a profit when the people needed it most. During famines or droughts, when the grain supply was scarce, traders would hoard their stock, creating an artificial shortage. As the demand for food soared, so did the prices. A single merchant, able to control the supply of grain, could hold the city and its people hostage, forcing the pharaoh himself to pay outrageous prices to feed the population. These manipulations didn't just hurt the people they affected, the very stability of Egypt itself. When the prices of grain were inflated to impossible heights, the people who relied on it for their survival found themselves facing starvation. The markets, once a symbol of Egypt's grandeur, became breeding grounds for unrest. In times of famine, the most vulnerable members of society, those with no power or influence, were left to bear the brunt of the suffering. The wealthy traders who manipulated the markets for profit, with their inflated prices and hoarded goods, remained untouched, insulated from the consequences of their actions. But these price manipulations didn't go unnoticed. The tensions between the elite and the common people grew, eventually spilling over into uprisings. Civil unrest was a constant threat in these tense moments, when the poor found themselves at the mercy of the marketplace's powerful elite. The consequences were often severe. Hungry, desperate people began to rise against the very system that kept them oppressed. What started as small protests over rising food prices quickly grew into full-scale revolts. These uprisings, fueled by the people's frustration and suffering, were met with brutal force from the pharaoh's soldiers, desperate to maintain the illusion of stability. Yet, despite the pharaoh's best efforts, the power of the marketplace was undeniable. It was no longer just about commerce, it had become a force in and of itself, a symbol of the larger struggle between the rulers and the ruled. The influence of Egypt's marketplace extended far beyond its borders. While Egypt's economy thrived, it was built upon an aggressive foreign trade strategy. Egypt's monopoly on key commodities, such as grain and papyrus, made it a vital player in the ancient world, but it also created enemies. The wealthy elite who controlled these goods didn't just see themselves as rulers of the Nile, they saw themselves as rulers of the Mediterranean. The political and economic power Egypt wielded through its trade routes made it a target for neighboring empires, who began to resent Egypt's dominance. The manipulation of Egypt's goods for political gain was not just a local issue, it had international ramifications. Foreign trade, which had initially been a source of pride for Egypt, became a point of contention. As Egypt's markets became more tightly controlled by the elite, other powers began to feel the weight of Egypt's manipulation. The Phoenicians, the Nubians, and the Greeks, Egypt's major trade partners, were not blind to the ways in which Egypt bent trade agreements to its advantage. These nations, once eager to trade, began to see Egypt's practices as a form of exploitation, and their relationships with Egypt began to fray. Egypt's strength in trade, once seen as a symbol of prosperity, now became a weapon of economic dominance that others sought to challenge. Egypt's monopoly on goods like grain and papyrus gave it leverage over its neighbors, but it also left the empire vulnerable. As Egypt's economic policies became more aggressive, the seeds of resentment were sown in other nations. And though the Egyptians themselves may not have seen it at the time, these trade practices would soon have serious consequences. The very tools that Egypt had used to build its empire, manipulation, control, and exploitation of markets, would eventually contribute to its downfall. While the pharaohs reveled in the wealth brought by trade, they ignored the rising discontent within their own borders and beyond. The marketplace, once a symbol of Egypt's grandeur and the lifeblood of its empire, had transformed into a battleground. The very practices that had made Egypt powerful were the same ones that would ultimately sow the seeds of its decline. Egypt's wealth was no longer just a matter of prosperous trade. It had become a dangerous game of manipulation, where the price of power was often paid in the suffering of the people. Those who controlled the markets could control the kingdom, but in the process, they had created a system that was ripe for exploitation and instability. As the sun sank lower and the market quieted, the true price of Egypt's power became clear. What was once a place of thriving commerce had become a reflection of the broader struggles within the empire. The tension between the elite, who controlled the market, and the common people, who bore the brunt of its manipulation, would continue to shape Egypt's political future. The consequences of these market manipulations would reverberate throughout the empire, leading to greater instability and a gradual erosion of Egypt's once unshakable foundation. This chapter sets the stage for the eventual unraveling of Egypt's marketplace system. The manipulation of trade, the control of goods, and the weaponization of the market would soon lead to Egypt's vulnerability in the face of foreign invaders. The marketplace, once a symbol of Egypt's power, would eventually reflect the cracks in the empire's foundation, heralding the beginning of its decline. The next chapter will explore how these manipulations would lead to Egypt's downfall, both internally and on the world stage, as the empire faced increasing pressures from both within and beyond its borders. In the heart of ancient Egypt, beneath the weight of its powerful economy, the cracks of rebellion began to show. It was in the marketplace, once a symbol of Egypt's prosperity and vibrancy, that the tension between the elite and the common people began to boil over. The very system that had allowed Egypt to thrive, its complex networks of trade and the manipulation of resources, was now creating deep dissatisfaction among the lower classes. Grain, the cornerstone of Egypt's economy and the essential lifeblood for the people, had become the symbol of this growing frustration. Traders and merchants controlled its flow, and when times were tough, they withheld it, hoarding it to inflate prices and make even greater profits. For those who had nothing but the promise of the next meal to survive, these manipulations felt like a betrayal. The wealth of Egypt was no longer a product of prosperity. It had become a system of exploitation. The elite, those who controlled the grain, papyrus, and precious metals, grew wealthier with every transaction, while the common people struggled to make ends meet. They began to realize that their survival depended on more than just their ability to work the land or produce goods. It depended on their access to the marketplace, the very place where the essential goods of life were exchanged. The market, a symbol of Egypt's wealth and power, had become the tool of the rich and powerful to control and subjugate the poor. The pharaoh, once seen as the ruler of all Egypt, was no longer the protector of the people but an enabler of the system that oppressed them. While the elite manipulated the market for their gain, the pharaoh and his court turned a blind eye to the suffering of the masses. The marketplace, once a place of vibrant exchange, was now a place where food shortages and inflated prices left entire communities on the brink of starvation. As food became scarcer and prices soared, the lower classes found themselves unable to afford the very basics of life. They looked around and saw the elite getting richer while they were pushed deeper into poverty. The system that had once made Egypt prosperous was now breaking it apart. And in the quiet unrest of the marketplace, the seeds of rebellion began to sprout. It was in the marketplace that the first signs of resistance appeared. What began as murmurs of dissatisfaction quickly turned into acts of protest. Angry crowds, pushed to the edge by rising food prices and manipulated grain stores, began to riot in the streets. They marched to the market squares, demanding fair prices and access to food, only to be met with the force of the pharaoh's soldiers, who were eager to suppress any dissent. The tension in the air was palpable, and the marketplace, once a symbol of trade and prosperity, became a battlefield for justice and survival. But it wasn't just riots that marked the beginning of rebellion in Egypt's markets. Acts of sabotage against traders, who were seen as the puppets of the elite, became more common. Traders who were suspected of hoarding grain or inflating prices found their stalls overturned, their goods ruined, and their livelihood destroyed by angry citizens seeking to reclaim control of their own survival. The marketplace had become a place of conflict, not just between buyers and sellers, but between the people and the system that kept them oppressed. Behind the scenes, Egypt's intellectuals and religious leaders began to voice their concerns about the state of the market and the exploitation of the people. In a society where knowledge was often in the hands of the elite, these voices began to challenge the very foundations of Egypt's economic structure. The priests, once loyal to the pharaoh, began to speak out about the way in which the marketplace had been used as a tool of control rather than a place for fair trade. They saw the manipulation of grain, the artificial scarcity, and the suffering it caused, and they began to question the fairness of an economy that benefited only the powerful. At the same time, philosophical and spiritual movements began to rise, questioning the status quo and the way in which wealth and power were distributed. These movements, often inspired by the teachings of ancient Egyptian sages and philosophers, began to infiltrate the everyday workings of the marketplace. They encouraged the common people to rise up against the exploitation of the elite, to question the fairness of a system that allowed such inequality to flourish. These intellectuals, though few in number, began to challenge the very structure of Egyptian society, calling for a more just and equal distribution of resources. What started as quiet dissent within the marketplace began to spread, creating a ripple effect throughout Egyptian society. The frustrations of the lower classes, tired of being manipulated and exploited, gave birth to a desire for justice, equality, and change. The marketplace, once a place for commerce and trade, had become the birthplace of revolution. Behind the merchants and traders, something far darker was brewing, a thirst for justice and a refusal to accept the status quo. As the market became a battleground for survival, it became clear that this was no longer just about fair prices or access to grain. It was about control, the control of goods, the control of resources, and the control of the very future of Egypt. The lower classes were no longer willing to be silenced by the powers that held sway over the marketplace. They were ready to fight for their survival, to fight for their dignity, and to fight for a system that would serve them, not just the elite. The seeds of dissent had been planted, and now they were beginning to take root. The marketplace, once the heartbeat of Egypt's economy, had become the site of an uprising that would challenge the very foundation of Egyptian society. As the story of Egypt's rebellion in the markets began to unfold, it was clear that the struggle for justice had only just begun. And as this first wave of resistance began to gain momentum, the next chapter would reveal how the rebellion would erupt into full-blown revolts, acts of defiance that would shake Egypt to its core. The marketplace, with all its manipulation, deceit, and power struggles, had become the true arena of Egypt's fight for freedom. The resistance was no longer a quiet undercurrent, it was a force to be reckoned with, one that would challenge the very institutions that had long held power over the people. The marketplace, once a place of commerce, had become a battleground, a space where the oppressed no longer stayed silent. The tension that had simmered for so long in Egypt's markets finally erupted, and the consequences would be felt far beyond the stalls and alleyways where the protests began. It was no longer just about the manipulation of prices or the hoarding of grain, it was about the collapse of a system that had been built on the backs of the poor, and the people were no longer willing to bear that weight. The grain riots were the spark that ignited the flames of revolt across Egypt. The grain that once flowed freely through the markets, feeding the people, was now a commodity controlled by the elite, held back to force up prices. The common people, who had long suffered under this economic manipulation, had had enough. When food supplies ran low and grain prices soared, a wave of anger swept through the streets. What had once been whispered resentment became loud, unmistakable cries for justice. In the midst of growing hunger, the people stormed the granaries, those places that had once been sacred to Egypt's economic stability. The rich traders and the elite who controlled the grain were no longer safe in their palaces or behind their stalls. The common people, driven by desperation and the need to survive, seized control of the very supplies that had been withheld from them. It wasn't just about food anymore. It was about reclaiming a piece of the power that had been stolen from them. The marketplace had become the arena of rebellion, and for a brief moment, the people had the upper hand. Religious leaders, once quiet participants in the system of exploitation, began to lend their voices to the cause. Many priests, who had once sided with the pharaohs and the wealthy merchants, began to see the injustices happening around them. They recognized that the control of essential goods like grain, which was so deeply tied to the people's survival, was no longer just an economic issue, it was a moral one. Some priests, aligning themselves with the people, used their influence to call for action, to encourage the common people to rise up against the systems that kept them oppressed. The people, once powerless, began to feel the strength of their numbers and the righteousness of their cause. Religious leaders, though once the arbiters of the status quo, now found themselves in league with those demanding change. As the uprising spread, the elite traders and merchants, once the masters of Egypt's markets, found themselves caught in the storm. Those who had profited from the misery of the people were overthrown in dramatic displays of resistance. The market, once their domain, became the site of their downfall. The masses, empowered by the taste of victory, seized goods, wealth, and power from those who had long manipulated the system to their own benefit. The traders who had once held Egypt's economy in their grip found themselves exposed, vulnerable, and dethroned. For the first time in generations, the marketplace was in the hands of those it was meant to serve. But while this momentary reversal of power felt like a triumph, it was only the beginning of a larger, more violent struggle. The pharaoh and the ruling elite did not take kindly to the erosion of their authority. The uprisings, though successful in the short term, came at a great cost. In response, the elites retaliated with an iron fist. Military forces were dispatched to restore order, and the people who had dared to rise up were crushed beneath the weight of the state's power. Those who led the uprisings, priests, traders, and common citizens, were punished harshly. The pharaoh's soldiers marched through the streets, suppressing the rebellion and ensuring that the marketplace was returned to its rightful owners, the elite. The public spectacle of these reprisals sent a clear message to the people: resistance would not be tolerated. Yet, even in the face of such crushing retaliation, the seeds of rebellion had already been sown. The unrest within the marketplace had exposed the cracks in the system that could no longer be ignored. The elite, despite their success in quelling the uprisings, knew that the marketplace had become a symbol of the fragility of their power. The people had tasted victory, and they would not forget the taste of justice. The unrest that had sparked in the markets would never truly go away. It would linger, just beneath the surface, waiting for the right moment to resurface. The consequences of these revolts were far-reaching. While the elites were able to reassert control over Egypt's markets in the immediate aftermath, the system was forever changed. The markets had been exposed as not just places of trade, but battlegrounds for the survival of the kingdom's economic system. The uprisings had shown that the common people, when united and driven by a common cause, could challenge the very foundation of Egypt's power. And while the pharaohs might have regained control of the marketplace, they could no longer dismiss the voice of the people. The marketplace had become a battleground between the people and the powerful elite. The people, driven by their need for survival, and the elite, desperate to retain their stranglehold over Egypt's wealth, would continue to clash in this arena. The marketplace was no longer just a place for buying and selling, it was a symbol of the conflict that had begun to tear Egypt apart. As the sun began to set over the marketplace, the echoes of the day's rebellion still reverberated through the streets. The marketplace, once again, became a symbol of Egypt's greatest strength and its deepest fault lines. The next chapter will explore the aftermath of these revolts, the long-term consequences for Egypt's economy, the continued influence of the elites, and the role of the marketplace in shaping the political changes that followed. The question remained, were these uprisings enough to topple the Egyptian elite, or had the marketplace simply become another tool of oppression in the hands of the powerful? Only time would tell. In the wake of the uprisings that had shaken Egypt's marketplace, a sense of urgency filled the air. The elite, those who had once held the reins of Egypt's powerful economy, now found themselves in a precarious position. The very system that had ensured their wealth and dominance had been challenged by the masses. The revolt had torn at the fabric of Egypt's trade structure, exposing the fragile nature of their control. It was clear that to maintain their authority, the elites needed to act swiftly. But could they restore the marketplace to its former state, or had the flames of rebellion forever changed Egypt's economic landscape? The ruling class, consisting of the pharaohs, high-ranking priests, and powerful merchants, knew that their grip on power depended on their ability to reassert control. The chaos of the marketplace had shown the people's potential for resistance, and the elites were determined not to let that spark grow into a full-fledged fire. Military force was swiftly deployed to quell any remaining pockets of rebellion. Soldiers were stationed in key market areas where they could impose order and remind the people who held power. With the harsh crackdowns, the pharaoh sent a clear message. Any further acts of defiance would be met with swift and brutal retaliation. The leaders of the uprisings were arrested, and many were publicly executed as a warning to others who might dare to challenge the status quo. But while military force was an essential tool, it was not enough to truly restore order. The ruling class knew that in order to maintain their dominance, they needed to rebuild the trust of the people. The marketplace, once a symbol of prosperity, had become a battleground, and the elite knew that if the people did not trust the system, they would never fully regain control. To that end, they began to roll out reforms, measures that were meant to placate the masses and convince them that the system could work in their favor once again. These reforms, however, were largely superficial, meant only to provide the illusion of change. The pharaoh promised greater access to goods for the lower classes, claiming that prices would be regulated and that grain would flow freely through the markets. The elite traders who had been overthrown during the rebellion were reinstated, but their loyalty was now demanded. The reforms, though painted as a sign of the pharaoh's benevolence, were largely a smokescreen. Beneath the surface, the power dynamics remained unchanged. The traders who once hoarded grain or inflated prices were now given the means to continue their manipulation, though they had to act with more subtlety. The public, tired from the unrest but eager to see change, found themselves placated, but they were unaware that the system of exploitation had not been eradicated. It had simply been adjusted to ensure the elites retained control. As these superficial reforms took hold, the ruling class understood that they could not simply rely on military force and temporary measures to maintain their power. A more permanent solution was required. They turned to bureaucracy, an ancient tool of control. Bureaucratic systems, once relatively loose and unregulated, were now implemented to monitor and regulate every aspect of the marketplace. Appointed officials who answered directly to the pharaoh were placed in charge of overseeing trade routes, inspecting goods, and controlling the flow of resources. These officials were granted extensive power to ensure that Egypt's economy remained stable, but in reality, their role was far more insidious. By creating a centralized bureaucracy, the elites ensured that no one could challenge their authority without facing the full force of the state. The market was no longer a place where goods were freely exchanged between traders and buyers. It had become a space tightly controlled by a new class of bureaucrats. These officials, now embedded in every corner of Egypt's economic system, acted as gatekeepers. They determined who had access to valuable resources and who was left to scramble for the scraps. The elites used the bureaucracy not just to regulate the economy, but to cement their own position of power. They made sure that those who had benefited from the system before the uprisings continued to do so, while the common people were left with little more than the promises of reform. The wealthy traders, who had once hoarded goods, were now in charge of the very system that allowed them to do so. Their power reinforced by the pharaoh's administrative machinery. These new bureaucratic systems also allowed the elites to manipulate the legal framework surrounding trade. With more power over legal matters, they were able to regulate not just prices and the flow of goods, but also the relationships between traders and buyers. A dispute between two merchants over a bad deal could now be settled by an appointed official, who would make the decision based on the priorities of the elite, rather than the needs of the people. This legal control further solidified the elite's grip on power, as it created a system where justice could be bent to suit their needs. In this renewed system, the marketplace became less a place for free exchange and more a reflection of Egypt's tightly controlled economy. The ability of the elite to manipulate the flow of goods, to impose their will on trade, and to suppress dissent through military and bureaucratic means allowed them to maintain their power. But it also created a deeper divide in Egyptian society, as the gap between the ruling class and the common people widened further. The uprisings, while initially successful in challenging the system, had ultimately given way to a more entrenched and systematic form of control. The elites had learned from the rebellion, and they had adapted. The market, though temporarily disrupted, was now even more firmly under their control. Were the revolutions of the common people enough to topple Egypt's market system? Or had the power of the elite proven too deeply rooted to ever be toppled? In the short term, it seemed the latter was true. The people may have momentarily seized control of the marketplace, but the elites quickly reasserted their authority, using force, reform, and bureaucracy to solidify their dominance once again. The marketplace had become more than just a site of trade. It had become a tool of manipulation, where every transaction was monitored, every deal shaped by those who had the means to control it. As the elites reasserted control over the marketplace, they not only restored their wealth and influence, they reinforced the very structures that had allowed their rise. But this, too, would not last forever. The system they had rebuilt, though seemingly stable, was built on the same power dynamics that had caused the uprising in the first place. In the next section, we will explore how these elite measures to control Egypt's market would eventually lead to further unrest, setting the stage for a new wave of rebellion that would challenge the very heart of Egypt's power. In the aftermath of the uprisings and the reassertion of elite control over Egypt's markets, the landscape of trade underwent a subtle yet significant transformation. The elite had regained their dominance, but their actions had sparked a shift within the population. The people, tired of being manipulated and squeezed by the very system that was supposed to serve them, began to look for alternative ways to survive, ways that didn't rely on the official market structures controlled by the rich and powerful. What happened when the people refused to accept the system forced upon them? In Egypt, their resistance led to the creation of underground markets that would forever change the landscape of trade. The emergence of underground economies was, at first, a quiet rebellion, a whispered defiance against the suffocating control of the elite. However, as the manipulation of prices, the inflating of taxes, and the monopolization of essential goods continued, the underground economy began to grow rapidly. It started with small, private deals, a barter here, a quiet transaction there, but quickly, these exchanges grew into something far more significant. The common people, driven by necessity, sought out ways to bypass the official channels, finding ways to procure goods without falling victim to the inflated prices set by the elite. This was particularly true for grain, the lifeblood of Egypt, and textiles, which were essential to daily life. But it wasn't just the staples of the common folk that found their way into these hidden markets. Luxury goods, once reserved only for the wealthiest Egyptians, began to appear in the hands of the people, traded outside the gaze of the state's officials. The black market flourished in the shadows of Egypt's bustling, official marketplaces. Merchants and traders, once loyal to the pharaoh and the elite, now found themselves navigating a new world, one where their survival depended on their ability to operate outside the law. Goods that had once been controlled by the state or the rich were now freely traded between individuals in the streets and alleys, far from the prying eyes of the bureaucrats and soldiers who had once kept a tight grip on Egypt's economy. This underground world was filled with risks. For those caught trading outside the established system, the consequences could be severe punishments ranged from fines to imprisonment, and in some cases, even execution. But for many, the benefits outweighed the dangers. The black market allowed them to access goods they otherwise could not afford, and to engage in more equitable exchanges, where price inflation was absent and trade was determined by the actual value of goods, not by the manipulation of powerful elites. As the underground economy grew, it became a parallel system to the official market, a shadowy reflection of the state's economy. The more the elite attempted to control the market, the more they pushed the people into the arms of this alternative system. It was a rebellion not just against the pharaoh's rule, but against a system of control that had been entrenched for centuries. The masses had begun to create their own economy, one that existed in the margins, outside the reach of the elite. At the same time, the elites were not idle in their efforts to stabilize the system and rebuild their power. The state's attempts to modernize the economy led to the introduction of more sophisticated market regulations, but these measures often felt like little more than a new layer of control. The introduction of early forms of taxation, government-issued currency, and more formalized market structures were intended to rein in the chaos of the marketplace, but they often exacerbated the inequalities that had sparked the uprisings in the first place. The new systems were designed to centralize control further, to give the elite more authority over the flow of goods. But as taxes rose and the price of goods continued to climb, the population began to see these reforms for what they were: another way for the elite to tighten their grip on the economy. Despite these efforts, the changes that the elite implemented only further alienated the lower classes, who saw their lives become more difficult. The bureaucratic system, which was supposed to provide order and stability, often worked in favor of those already in power. Bureaucrats appointed by the pharaoh, many of them with ties to the elite traders, found ways to manipulate the system, further enriching themselves while the common people continued to suffer. The black market, which had already taken root, only flourished in response to these new regulations, as more and more Egyptians turned to underground trade to escape the crushing weight of taxes and market control. While the elite's control over the economy seemed to be reinforced by these bureaucratic measures, it also sowed the seeds for further instability. The very measures meant to restore order were creating an environment where dissent was not only justified but necessary. The black market became more than just a survival tactic, it became a symbol of resistance. The elites had made their power more entrenched, but they had also alienated the very people whose labor and support they depended on. The underground economy was a testament to the failure of the state to provide for its citizens, and it became increasingly difficult for the ruling class to ignore. This transformation in Egypt's markets was not just about the rise of an alternative economy. It was about the shift in the balance of power. The people had begun to reclaim a measure of control, not through rebellion, but through quiet resistance. They had found a way to subvert the system, to create their own networks of exchange that operated outside the reach of the state. And while these underground markets would not have the power to topple the elite completely, they were a clear sign that the people were no longer content with the status quo. The cracks in the system were widening, and the elite could no longer claim to have full control over Egypt's economy. This shift also marked the beginning of Egypt's vulnerability. While the elite remained in control of the formal economy, the rise of the underground economy and the increasing dissatisfaction of the common people set the stage for the eventual decline of Egypt's market system. The elites may have regained control, but they had also created a more divided and unstable society. This divide would eventually lead to greater challenges, not just from within, but from external forces as well. As Egypt's markets evolved, the groundwork was laid for the forces that would eventually reshape the marketplace altogether. The elite-controlled economy that had once allowed Egypt to thrive was beginning to show signs of failure, and the underground economy that had emerged in response was a symbol of this growing instability. The system was being challenged from within, and external influences, particularly from Greece and Rome, would soon add to the pressure. These forces would bring with them new trade practices and economic systems that would further destabilize the Egyptian market and reshape its future. As Egypt's market system continued to evolve, the struggles between the elite and the people would intensify, leading to greater change. The next chapter will explore how external forces, particularly the Greek and Roman empires, began to influence Egypt's economy, further shifting the balance of power and transforming the marketplace into something entirely new. In 332 BCE, Egypt was thrust into a new era when Alexander the Great's armies marched into the heart of the ancient kingdom. The conquest marked the beginning of a profound transformation, not only politically but also economically. Alexander's victory laid the groundwork for the establishment of the Ptolemaic dynasty, a new Greek rule that would alter the very fabric of Egyptian society. Under the Ptolemies, the traditional Egyptian market system, deeply rooted in barter and local trade, would be replaced with a new, expansive model of commerce, one that bridged Egypt with the wider Mediterranean world. The arrival of the Greeks introduced sweeping changes, as their methods of governance, trade, and economics began to reshape the landscape. At the heart of this transformation was Alexandria, the vibrant new capital city founded by Alexander himself. Under Greek rule, Alexandria quickly became one of the ancient world's most important trading hubs, an economic powerhouse that connected the East with the West. The Greeks, with their advanced knowledge of commerce, brought with them a set of new practices that would gradually replace Egypt's more localized economy. The Ptolemies brought a state-controlled monopoly system that deeply influenced the marketplace. The government took control over essential resources like grain, which had once flowed freely through Egypt's markets in a more decentralized manner. Now, Egypt's grain trade, a vital part of its economy, was controlled and regulated by the state. While this allowed for greater organization and control, it also restricted the ability of local traders to operate freely. The Ptolemies imposed taxes on production and trade, collecting tribute not just from the local populace but also from the lands they ruled. This centralized control over the market made the economy more predictable and stable, but it also limited the independence of Egypt's traditional merchants. One of the most significant shifts brought about by Greek rule was the introduction of a standardized currency. Under the Ptolemies, coinage was minted and used for the first time in large-scale trade. The move away from barter-based transactions, where goods were exchanged based on their intrinsic value, to a system of money-based exchange fundamentally altered the way Egyptians conducted business. Coinage not only facilitated trade but also allowed the Greeks to more easily extract taxes and control the flow of wealth within Egypt. It was now possible to engage in trade without relying on the direct exchange of goods, a shift that had profound implications for Egypt's economy. However, this new system also distanced many Egyptians from the marketplace, as they were unfamiliar with the new form of currency and its complexities. The influx of Greek merchants, officials, and soldiers into Egypt created a new class of foreign elites who dominated the market. While local Egyptians had long been the backbone of Egypt's trade system, they now found themselves increasingly sidelined. Greek merchants, with their superior knowledge of Mediterranean trade routes, introduced luxury goods and new commodities to Egypt, everything from fine Greek pottery to exotic goods brought in from Persia and further afield. The market, once focused on the exchange of local staples, now began to flourish with foreign goods. Alexandria became the melting pot of the ancient world, with goods flowing in from across the Mediterranean, expanding Egypt's commercial horizons. The once closed, localized economy of Egypt had evolved into part of a much larger, integrated global system. However, this new economic model did not come without its problems. While the Greek elite thrived under the new system, the local Egyptian population often found themselves excluded from the benefits of this expanded economy. The monopolies held by Greek merchants and the state control of essential goods meant that the Egyptian people had less access to the resources they needed to survive. The growing divide between the local population and the Greek rulers created an undercurrent of tension that would continue throughout Ptolemaic rule. The rise of Alexandria as a center of wealth and power was symbolic of the changes brought by Greek rule. Yet, the benefits of this wealth were not evenly distributed. The Ptolemies, in their pursuit of power, centralized Egypt's resources in Alexandria, making it the heartbeat of the kingdom's economy. Wealth flowed into the hands of the Greek elite, while the common people, many of whom had once thrived in the more open trade system, found themselves struggling to adapt. The introduction of new forms of taxation and the regulation of trade put additional pressure on Egypt's farmers and traders. They were forced to navigate a system that favored the rich and powerful, while the majority of the population was left to face growing inequality. The Greek approach to commerce also brought about a fundamental shift in how goods were valued. The concept of value was no longer tied to local needs or the worth of goods within the community. Instead, it became linked to a global market where supply and demand were dictated by a network of foreign powers, merchants, and the state. Egyptian grain, once exchanged freely with neighboring regions, was now a commodity traded for luxury items like Greek pottery, fine silks, and even slaves. Egypt's economic role had shifted from that of a self-sustaining civilization to a resource provider for a much larger imperial network. This shift in priorities meant that many traditional Egyptian traders, who had once controlled the flow of goods, found themselves displaced by foreign competition. Yet, despite the challenges posed by Greek rule, the marketplace continued to thrive, though, in ways that the traditional Egyptians may not have recognized. Alexandria, under the Ptolemies, became a bustling, cosmopolitan city, its markets filled with a wealth of goods from across the known world. The city's famous Library of Alexandria became a symbol of this intellectual and commercial exchange, attracting scholars, merchants, and travelers from across the empire. The merging of Greek and Egyptian cultures, while not always harmonious, brought about an exchange of ideas, goods, and practices that would shape the course of history. But this period of Greek dominance was not without its flaws. The monopolies, the favoritism towards the Greek elite, and the centralization of wealth in Alexandria created resentment among the local population. The growing divide between the Greeks and the Egyptians set the stage for future conflicts, as the Egyptians began to question the fairness of the system that had been imposed upon them. The marketplace, once a symbol of Egypt's independence and self-sufficiency, had now become a reflection of the empire's shifting power dynamics, a place where the rich grew richer and the poor were increasingly excluded. What happens when a foreign empire enters and reshapes Egypt's market? The Greeks didn't just bring new goods, they brought an entirely new system of commerce, one that shifted the very foundations of Egypt's economy. The integration of Egypt into the larger Mediterranean trade network was a double-edged sword, offering new opportunities while eroding Egypt's traditional market structure. As we move into the next phase of Egypt's economic history, we'll explore the rise of Roman influence, which would build on the changes introduced by the Greeks and further transform the Egyptian marketplace, creating even more challenges for the common people and ultimately reshaping Egypt's economic future. In 30 BCE, Egypt's centuries-old reign as a powerful, independent kingdom came to a dramatic end. After the defeat of Queen Cleopatra and the collapse of the Ptolemaic dynasty, Egypt was absorbed into the vast Roman Empire. The arrival of Roman control marked the beginning of a new economic era for Egypt, one where the needs and demands of an empire stretched far beyond the interests of the local population. What had once been a self-sustaining, thriving economy rooted in Egypt's agricultural wealth and bustling marketplaces was now to be shaped by Rome's militarized economic policies, with little regard for the common people who had once controlled it. Under Roman rule, Egypt's wealth, particularly its grain production, was extracted on a massive scale. The fertile land along the Nile, once a source of sustenance for the Egyptian people, became a crucial supplier for the Roman Empire. Grain, which had been Egypt's lifeblood, was now harvested primarily to feed the Roman legions and satisfy the demands of Rome's expanding imperial capital. While the Egyptian marketplace continued to operate, much of Egypt's output was no longer directed toward local needs or local merchants. Instead, the flow of goods was controlled by Roman officials, who made sure that the majority of Egypt's agricultural bounty went to support the Roman state. The Egyptian economy, which had once thrived on its own terms, was now subordinated to the needs of an empire that saw Egypt as little more than a resource to be extracted. The Roman military and bureaucratic system further centralized the economy. Roman officials were appointed to oversee Egypt's vast agricultural estates, many of which had been seized for imperial use. These officials exercised enormous control over the land, dictating what crops would be grown, how they would be harvested, and where they would be sent. The local Egyptian economy, which had once relied on a network of independent traders and agricultural communities, was increasingly bound to the whims of Roman administrators. The Romans didn't just control Egypt's grain, they controlled every aspect of its economy. Taxes were levied on the population to support the empire's military campaigns, and the price of essential goods was dictated by Roman need, leaving little room for local traders to thrive. As Rome's presence in Egypt grew, Roman merchants, soldiers, and bureaucrats began to dominate the Egyptian markets. Alexandria, once the heart of Egypt's diverse and bustling trade, saw its role as a commercial center gradually diminish. What had once been a melting pot of cultures and a hub for Mediterranean trade became, under Roman rule, a focal point for extracting wealth from Egypt. Alexandria's once vibrant markets, filled with goods from across the ancient world, now largely served the empire's needs. The luxury goods and exotic products that had once flowed into Egypt were now overshadowed by Roman goods, and the once thriving trade routes were redirected to benefit Rome's imperial ambitions. For the common Egyptian, life in the marketplace became increasingly difficult. While the elites, the Roman merchants and officials enjoyed the fruits of their control, the local population faced mounting hardships. The Roman taxation system placed heavy burdens on the poor, who found themselves struggling to make ends meet while their resources were siphoned off to support the Roman military and the empire's lavish lifestyle. The Egyptian people, already weakened by years of exploitation under the Ptolemies, now faced the full weight of Roman demands. The markets, once a place where goods were exchanged for the benefit of the people, became sites of exploitation where the lower classes were pushed to the margins of society. But even under this heavy-handed control, the Egyptian spirit of resistance remained. As Rome's domination expanded, so did the discontent within Egypt's marketplace. Local Egyptian merchants, who had once enjoyed a certain degree of independence, found themselves increasingly squeezed out of the market by the influx of Roman merchants and bureaucrats. Yet, despite their diminished role, they continued to resist. Some began to find ways to subvert the system, seeking to bypass the increasingly centralized trade structures that benefited the Roman elite. Local barter systems began to re-emerge, albeit in a more covert fashion. as Egyptians sought to circumvent the official marketplace where they were subjected to Roman control. These merchants, while operating in the shadows, maintained a sense of rebellion by trying to preserve Egypt's traditional ways of trade, though their efforts were often stifled by Roman repression. The resistance did not go unnoticed by the Roman authorities. As Egyptian merchants and traders found ways to resist Roman economic policies, they were met with severe punishment. The Roman military, always present in the country to keep order, was quick to squash any signs of dissent. In an empire that relied on strict control over its provinces, there was no room for rebellion, especially in the economic realm. Roman officials were dispatched to suppress any subversion of the imperial economy, and those who were caught resisting were either executed or severely punished. The marketplace, once a place for vibrant local exchange, had become a site of repression, where even the smallest act of rebellion could lead to catastrophic consequences. The consequences of Roman control were deeply felt in Egypt's economy. While the Romans had secured their grip on the markets, they had also set in motion the eventual collapse of the local economies. The more the Roman Empire extracted from Egypt, the less the local Egyptian population had to support their own communities. The marketplace, once a symbol of Egypt's wealth and independence, had become a hollow shell, dominated by imperial interests. The local Egyptian merchants, once the lifeblood of the economy, were slowly pushed out of the picture, their influence waning as Roman merchants took center stage. As Egypt's traditional economy crumbled under Roman domination, the consequences were far-reaching. The local marketplace, which had once served as a vital economic and cultural space for Egyptians, now operated primarily for the benefit of Rome. The rich and diverse trade system that had characterized Egypt for centuries was slowly replaced by a rigid, imperial-driven economy that favored Rome's needs above all else. The once thriving Egyptian marketplace, where local goods and services were exchanged, was now merely a cog in the vast machinery of the Roman Empire. Could Egypt's ancient marketplace survive under the weight of Roman control? The answer, tragically, was no. As the Romans tightened their grip on Egypt's resources, the heart of Egypt's economy began to crumble under the imperial demands and exploitation. The marketplace, once a place of economic power and cultural exchange, was now little more than a tool used to support Rome's far-reaching empire. As we move forward, we will explore the ultimate consequences of Roman domination on Egypt's society and economy, and how the final destruction of Egypt's independent marketplace set the stage for the cultural and economic decline that would follow. As Greece and then Rome gradually took control of Egypt, they didn't just reshape its political and economic landscape, they began to erode the very cultural identity of the Egyptian people. The once proud civilization, with its millennia-old traditions, found itself struggling to maintain its heritage in the shadow of foreign empires that imposed their own values, beliefs, and customs. The marketplace, once a vibrant reflection of Egypt's ancient culture, began to mirror the cultural shifts sweeping across the land as Egyptian traditions gave way to Greek and Roman influence. The Ptolemies, who ruled Egypt after Alexander the Great's conquest, initiated the first wave of cultural transformation. Greek became the language of the elite, displacing the ancient Egyptian tongue among the upper classes, and was used in official records, administration, and even within temples. Greek art, architecture, and philosophy began to dominate the intellectual and cultural spheres. The once distinctive Egyptian artistic style, rooted in millennia of tradition, was now infused with Hellenistic elements. Temples that had once honored the gods of ancient Egypt began to incorporate Greek designs, and Greek gods such as Zeus and Athena were introduced alongside Egypt's own pantheon. Egyptian gods were reinterpreted through the lens of Greek mythology, resulting in hybrid deities like Serapis, a god created by the Ptolemies to bridge the gap between Greek and Egyptian religious practices. This fusion of cultures, referred to as Hellenistic Egypt, created a complex and often contradictory environment. For many Egyptians, it was a time of great cultural dissonance. They were caught between the pressures to uphold their ancient traditions and the necessity to adapt to the growing influence of Greek culture. The marketplaces, which had once been places where local traditions were celebrated and preserved, now became sites where foreign goods, customs, and ideas slowly displaced the indigenous practices. Greek merchants, soldiers, and bureaucrats became the dominant forces in Egypt's economy, and the marketplace began to reflect this shift as Greek and foreign items filled the stalls alongside traditional Egyptian wares. The Romans, who conquered Egypt in 30 BCE, further accelerated this cultural transformation. While the Roman Empire maintained much of the Greek influence in terms of art, architecture, and intellectual pursuits, they imposed their own governance and religious practices. The Roman imperial cult, which demanded the worship of the emperor as a divine figure, was introduced to Egypt. This was a direct challenge to the Egyptian system of religious beliefs, in which the pharaoh was considered a living god and the central figure in Egypt's spiritual and political life. The notion of a foreign ruler, a Roman emperor, being venerated as a god was difficult for many Egyptians to accept, especially when they had long believed that their rulers were direct descendants of the gods themselves. The introduction of this foreign religious system created a deep sense of cultural alienation for the Egyptian people. The market, once the heart of Egyptian culture and commerce, became increasingly dominated by Roman officials, soldiers, and merchants. The Roman presence in Egypt not only deepened the divide between the ruling class and the common people, but also introduced new hierarchies in the social order. While the local Egyptian population found themselves relegated to the lower echelons of society, Greek and Roman elites grew in power, both economically and politically. The Egyptian marketplace, which had once celebrated the diversity of local trade and culture, now reflected a world where Egyptian voices were increasingly drowned out by the overwhelming presence of foreign influence. As the Romans solidified their control over Egypt, they imposed a more rigid social and economic structure that further marginalized the Egyptian people. The marketplace, where Egyptians had once been able to engage in trade on relatively equal footing, now became a space dominated by Roman priorities. Goods that had once been produced and traded for the benefit of the local population were now increasingly redirected toward the Roman Empire. The once vibrant Egyptian economy was reshaped to serve imperial needs, with Egypt's wealth being siphoned off to feed the Roman imperial machine. Local Egyptian merchants, who had once controlled the trade of everyday goods, found themselves overshadowed by Roman officials and merchants who held the real power in Egypt's markets. Culturally, this transformation was devastating. The Egyptians, proud of their long and rich history, watched as their identity began to be erased. Egyptian traditions, once preserved in temples, tombs, and marketplaces, now competed with the growing influence of Greek and Roman ideologies. The markets, once the heart of Egyptian social life, became symbols of this cultural erosion as the foreign elite took control of the very spaces where Egyptians had once expressed their identity through commerce and trade. For the Egyptians, the consequences of this cultural shift were profound. They found themselves caught between two worlds, one that they had known for centuries and one that was being imposed upon them by foreign rulers. The marketplace, which had once been a place of cultural expression, now reflected the dominance of Greek and Roman ideas, with local Egyptian traditions being marginalized. The growing presence of Greek and Roman goods in the marketplace signaled the decline of Egypt's once thriving local industries, as foreign products flooded the market and displaced indigenous Egyptian crafts. As Egypt's identity was increasingly shaped by foreign powers, the marketplaces where Egyptians had once felt connected to their culture began to feel alien. The influence of Greek and Roman philosophies, arts, and religions seeped into every aspect of Egyptian life. The once strong Egyptian religious traditions, centered around the worship of the gods and the divine nature of the pharaoh, were gradually replaced by the worship of foreign deities and imperial cults. The Egyptians, in their own land, were forced to adapt to a new world order where their cultural practices were no longer valued as they once had been. What happens when a culture as ancient and powerful as Egypt's is overrun by foreign powers? The arrival of Greek and Roman influence did not just mark the conquest of Egypt's land, it marked the gradual transformation of Egypt's very identity. Greece and Rome didn't just conquer, they reshaped Egypt at its very core, erasing centuries of tradition and identity. As the marketplace, once a thriving reflection of Egypt's culture and economy, became increasingly dominated by foreign practices, the heart of Egyptian society slowly began to crumble under the weight of external influences. As we transition to the next section, we will explore the lasting impact of these cultural shifts on Egypt's economy, particularly the marketplace. The decline of Egypt's traditional markets, once a powerful symbol of its ancient civilization, is intimately tied to the cultural erosion caused by Greek and Roman domination. The social and economic implications of these shifts will shape the trajectory of Egypt's marketplace, setting the stage for its ultimate decline. The transformation of Egypt under Roman rule marked the final stages of its ancient market system, once a vibrant pillar of the kingdom's economy and cultural identity. By the time Rome solidified its control over Egypt, much of the local economic structure had already been redefined by Greek influence. But it was the Roman policies that truly suffocated Egypt's traditional market system. As a province of the Roman Empire, Egypt's markets began to reflect the growing dominance of imperial needs over local interests. No longer a center of local trade and cultural exchange, Egypt's once thriving marketplace became nothing more than a tool for the extraction of resources, serving the economic and political agendas of Rome. At the heart of this transformation was Egypt's role as the breadbasket of the Roman Empire. Egypt had long been the source of the empire's grain supply, but under Roman control, this role was dramatically expanded. Grain, once a commodity traded within Egypt's borders and across the Mediterranean, was now redirected almost entirely to Rome. Egypt's vast agricultural lands, which had once provided for the needs of its own people, were now seen primarily as a resource to support the growing demands of the empire. This meant that much of the food produced in Egypt, as well as other essential goods, was no longer available in the local marketplaces. Instead, these resources were sent directly to Rome, further enriching the Roman state while leaving the Egyptian population to suffer from scarcity and inflated prices. The local market, which had once been a dynamic space for exchange, became increasingly hollow as the imperial extraction of wealth intensified. As Egypt's agricultural output was redirected toward Roman consumption, everyday Egyptians found it increasingly difficult to obtain the goods they needed. The once bustling markets, which had teemed with local produce and handcrafted goods, became constrained by shortages. Basic necessities, such as grain and textiles, became scarce in Egypt's urban centers, while prices soared. Under Roman control, the marketplace was no longer a space for free exchange or community vitality. It was regulated, controlled, and directed by Roman authorities. Roman tax collectors imposed high taxes on the people, draining any remaining wealth from the lower classes and funneling it into the coffers of the empire. The economic policies implemented by the Romans further centralized control, stripping local Egyptian merchants of their autonomy. Once the backbone of Egypt's economy, local traders now found themselves sidelined in favor of Roman merchants, soldiers, and officials who flooded Egypt's markets. With the introduction of Roman coinage, traditional Egyptian barter systems, which had long served as a means of exchange, were pushed into the background. The new Roman currency and financial system shifted the power dynamics, concentrating economic control in the hands of the Roman elite. As Roman money flooded Egypt's markets, the wealth accumulated by Egyptian merchants was overshadowed by the influx of imperial capital. In this new economy, it became increasingly difficult for local Egyptians to engage in larger commercial ventures, and many resorted to small-scale, local bartering as a means of survival. This shift in economic power also had cultural consequences. Egyptian goods, once highly valued across the Mediterranean for their craftsmanship, began to fade from the markets. Traditional Egyptian textiles, pottery, and other cultural products, which had been sought after by traders from across the empire, were slowly replaced by imported Roman goods. Greek and Roman art, jewelry, and luxury items began to dominate Egypt's markets, and local Egyptian crafts were pushed to the periphery. The products that once defined Egypt's place in the ancient world products that were both cultural symbols and economic drivers became less and less visible in the marketplace. As Roman merchants and soldiers increasingly filled Egypt's trading spaces, they not only imposed new commercial practices but also marginalized the cultural identity that had once been expressed in Egypt's traditional goods and crafts. The market, which had once served as the heartbeat of Egyptian culture, now became a symbol of imperial exploitation. What had once been a space of cultural exchange and local commerce became a tool of Roman conquest. The marketplace, no longer a place where Egyptians could freely exchange goods and ideas, was now focused solely on feeding the Roman Empire's needs. The bustling, diverse marketplaces of Egypt, filled with the vibrant sounds of trade and conversation, were replaced with a much quieter, more controlled environment, one where Roman priorities overshadowed the local needs of the population. As the local economy suffered, the people of Egypt became more and more alienated from the market system. The traditional social and economic networks that had once sustained Egyptian society were disintegrating under Roman rule. The vibrant, diverse marketplace where Egyptians once traded in local goods, exchanged stories, and celebrated their cultural identity had slowly been transformed into a vehicle for imperial exploitation. Roman officials, who had become the new masters of Egypt's economy, used their control over the market to reinforce their dominance, further pushing the Egyptian population to the margins. The once thriving marketplace had become a shadow of its former self. As Egypt's resources were extracted to serve the needs of the Roman Empire, the local economy became increasingly subjugated to foreign demands. Egyptian merchants and local traders, once the lifeblood of Egypt's commerce, were relegated to secondary roles, while Roman elites dominated the flow of wealth. This cultural and economic decline mirrored Egypt's broader loss of autonomy and identity. The marketplace, once a reflection of Egypt's strength and vibrancy, had become an instrument of Roman control, stripping away the last vestiges of Egypt's old economic power. Could Egypt's ancient marketplace survive the crushing weight of Roman control? The answer was no. As Egypt's market system became more tightly controlled by the imperial powers, its role as a space for cultural expression and local commerce faded. The traditional Egyptian economy, once based on local trade and craftsmanship, was effectively erased under Roman domination, replaced by a system that prioritized the needs of the empire. The decline of Egypt's independence was mirrored in the decline of its market system, which became less a place of cultural exchange and more a tool of imperial exploitation. This section sets the stage for the next chapter, where we will explore the final collapse of Egypt's market system as the pressures of Roman control, combined with the continued erosion of local power and cultural identity, led to Egypt's full integration into the Roman Empire. The transformation of Egypt from an independent and self-sustaining civilization to a subordinate province marks the end of its ancient market system and the beginning of a new era in Egypt's history, one defined by Roman economic policies and imperial dominance. In 30 BCE, following the defeat of Cleopatra and the end of the Ptolemaic dynasty, Egypt was officially absorbed into the Roman Empire. The once proud civilization, with its ancient traditions and thriving markets, was now a mere province under Roman control. At first, Egypt was a vital asset to Rome, offering immense wealth, particularly in its agricultural output. The fertile lands along the Nile were crucial to the empire's ability to feed its people, and Egypt's strategic position at the crossroads of Africa and the Mediterranean made it a key piece in Rome's territorial and economic dominance. Yet, with this newfound importance came an inevitable shift in how Egypt was governed, and how its markets, once centers of local culture and commerce, became tools of Roman exploitation. Under Roman rule, Egypt's economy became fully centralized, its markets stripped of the local autonomy they had once enjoyed. The economic lifeblood of Egypt, its grain, its textiles, and its other essential goods were now entirely directed by the needs of the Roman Empire. No longer could the Egyptian marketplace function as it once had, as a site of local exchange and cultural identity. Instead, the empire dictated what goods could be traded, how much of them would be produced, and where they would be sent. Roman officials and soldiers were stationed in key cities to oversee the flow of goods, particularly grain, which was funneled directly to Rome to sustain its population and military. Local merchants, once the backbone of Egypt's economic system, found themselves sidelined as Roman merchants and officials took control of the trade. The result was that Egypt's wealth, once spread among the local population, was now steadily drained away to Rome. The markets that had once been a vibrant exchange of goods now functioned to serve Roman imperial demands. The Egyptians, proud of their long-standing trading traditions, were reduced to subjugated participants in an economy designed to benefit the empire. The local marketplace, which had once represented Egypt's independence, became an instrument of exploitation, with the empire's needs dictating what goods were available and at what cost. High taxes were levied on the local population to fund the empire's endeavors, and the control of essential resources, especially grain, was taken out of the hands of the people who had once managed it. Roman governance and imperial policies deeply affected Egypt's local markets, and these changes were particularly noticeable in cities like Alexandria. Alexandria had long been Egypt's cultural and commercial hub, a center of trade, learning, and intellectual exchange. Under Roman control, the city became increasingly Romanized, with Roman laws, commerce, and governance shaping every aspect of its daily life. Roman merchants flooded the streets, and the once diverse mix of goods exchanged in Alexandria's markets became dominated by Roman products. Goods from across the Mediterranean, including Roman pottery, textiles, and luxury items, replaced the local Egyptian goods that had once been the heart of the marketplace. The introduction of Roman coinage also played a significant role in altering Egypt's economic landscape. The use of Roman currency, which was initially introduced as a way to facilitate trade within the empire, further consolidated economic power in the hands of the Roman elite. Egyptian merchants, once accustomed to a local system of exchange, now had to adapt to the use of foreign currency, which favored Roman merchants and officials. With the growing influx of Roman coinage, the value of local Egyptian goods diminished as they became less desirable compared to the goods imported from Rome. The traditional barter systems, which had sustained Egypt's economy for centuries, were slowly pushed to the margins, further eroding the independence of Egypt's marketplace. Despite these challenges, Alexandria remained an important city, though its role had shifted. While the city continued to be a cultural center, it was now firmly under Roman control. The intellectual and artistic life of Alexandria, which had once flourished with the exchange of ideas from all corners of the Mediterranean, was increasingly shaped by Roman ideals. Roman laws governed the city's affairs, and the once thriving markets of Alexandria, filled with diverse goods from across the ancient world, were now dominated by the needs of the empire. Alexandria, which had once been a symbol of Egypt's economic and cultural independence, had become a symbol of Roman power, a place where Egypt's economic potential was harnessed to fuel the empire's ambitions. The social consequences of this transformation were stark. The once proud Egyptian merchant class, which had long been central to the country's economy, found itself marginalized. Roman merchants and soldiers took over the most lucrative parts of Egypt's trade, while the local population was left to face rising poverty and increasing economic inequality. The Egyptians, who had once controlled their own markets and resources, were now relegated to the lower echelons of society, while Roman elites grew ever wealthier. The marketplace, once a site for the exchange of ideas, goods, and cultures, became an arena for the consolidation of Roman imperial power. How did Egypt's once independent market system dissolve into the hands of an empire? Under Roman rule, Egypt's marketplaces ceased to be the vibrant spaces of cultural exchange they once were. The economic policies imposed by Rome transformed the marketplace into a tool of imperial exploitation. No longer a place where Egyptians could engage in the trade of their own goods, the marketplace became a site for the extraction of Egypt's wealth, funneled into the hands of Roman officials and the elite. The once thriving local markets, where Egyptians once proudly traded their goods and crafts, were now an extension of Roman control, serving the needs of a distant empire. This section illustrates how Egypt's integration into the Roman Empire ultimately led to the dissolution of its traditional market system. The consequences of this economic shift were felt throughout Egyptian society, as the local population was gradually excluded from the marketplace that had once been central to their lives. As we move into the next section, we'll explore the broader implications of this integration, particularly how the Romans further reshaped Egypt's cultural and economic landscape, marking the complete loss of Egypt's independence and identity. Egypt's integration into the Roman Empire marked the end of a chapter in the country's long and storied history. Once a thriving, independent civilization with its own distinct market systems and cultural identity, Egypt became a crucial province in the vast Roman Empire. As the empire solidified its control over Egypt's resources, the local economy and marketplace underwent a profound transformation, one that would ultimately erase much of Egypt's uniqueness. In this section, we will explore the long-term economic and cultural consequences of Egypt's integration into the Roman world, focusing on how the country's traditional systems were reshaped and, in many ways, dismantled by imperial rule. Under Roman domination, Egypt's economy shifted from one focused on local prosperity to one serving the needs of the empire. Egypt's vast agricultural wealth, particularly its grain production, became a crucial part of Rome's supply chain. The fertile Nile Valley, which had once sustained Egypt's people, now fed the Roman legions and Roman citizens. While Egypt continued to produce vast quantities of grain, most of this wealth was redirected to Rome rather than benefiting local Egyptians. The grain that had once been sold in Egypt's bustling markets was now funneled directly to Rome, leaving Egypt's local markets bereft of vital resources. The once thriving Egyptian marketplaces, where goods were traded freely and locally, now catered primarily to the needs of Roman officials, soldiers, and merchants. With the majority of Egypt's wealth now directed toward Rome, local Egyptians found themselves excluded from the benefits of the marketplace. The resources that once sustained local economies were siphoned off, and the goods that had once been abundant in the Egyptian markets became scarce. The high taxes imposed by Rome to fund its empire placed a heavy burden on the local population, making it even harder for ordinary Egyptians to afford basic goods. In the face of rising poverty and economic dislocation, many Egyptians were pushed to the margins of the commercial sphere, relegated to small-scale, localized exchanges, while the wealth of the land was monopolized by Roman authorities. The cultural consequences of this economic shift were just as profound. As Egypt's marketplace became more and more dominated by Roman goods, architecture, and customs, the uniqueness of Egypt's traditions began to fade. Egyptian merchants, once key players in the Mediterranean economy, now found themselves sidelined by the growing presence of Roman traders and officials. Goods that had once been staples of Egyptian culture, such as papyrus, linen, and fine jewelry, were increasingly displaced by Roman imports. Roman pottery, Roman glassware, and Roman luxury goods flooded the markets, and traditional Egyptian crafts, once prized across the ancient world, became less desirable. The markets, once vibrant with the exchange of Egyptian goods, now reflected the economic and cultural dominance of Rome. Egyptian identity, once proudly embodied in its commerce, architecture, and religious practices, was gradually erased by the pervasive influence of Roman imperialism. Despite the overwhelming tide of Romanization, a certain degree of Egyptian resilience persisted, especially in rural areas. In these more isolated regions, Egyptians continued to practice their traditional barter systems, resisting the full assimilation into the Roman economic structure. These small pockets of resistance kept elements of Egypt's ancient market practices alive, even as the empire expanded its control. However, as Roman governance became more entrenched, even these small systems of local exchange were gradually absorbed into the imperial economy. The Roman presence in Egypt was omnipresent, and over time, Egypt's economy, once a source of cultural pride, was subsumed into the larger Roman system, further diminishing the country's unique identity. Perhaps the most profound cultural shift came in Egypt's religious life. The traditional Egyptian religious practices, which had been deeply intertwined with the marketplace and daily life, began to give way to Roman and later Christian influences. The rise of Christianity, influenced heavily by Roman imperial policies, gradually displaced Egypt's ancient religious practices. Temples dedicated to the gods of Egypt, such as Amun, Ra, and Osiris, were replaced by temples dedicated to Roman gods and the imperial cult, where emperors were worshipped as divine figures. Religious festivals, once rooted in the ancient Egyptian calendar, gave way to Roman and Christian observances. The temples that had once served as cultural and spiritual centers for the Egyptian people now became symbols of imperial power and Romanization. The gradual erosion of Egypt's religious and cultural identity was reflected in its marketplaces. Where once Egyptian goods, religious offerings, and locally made crafts had been exchanged, now Roman products and foreign cultural symbols dominated. The Egyptian marketplace, once a place where local customs, goods, and traditions flourished, became increasingly homogeneous as Roman and Christian influences gradually took over. The once vibrant exchange of Egyptian culture and commerce gave way to the impersonal and exploitative system of Roman imperial trade. As Roman laws, religion, and customs overtook Egyptian traditions, the cultural and economic heart of Egypt slowly faded into the larger framework of the Roman Empire. What happens when a proud civilization's soul is slowly erased by an imperial power? The answer, tragically, is that Egypt's unique identity was progressively submerged under the crushing weight of Roman rule. As Egypt's marketplace was subsumed into the Roman imperial economy, its once vibrant identity, its rich history of trade, culture, and religion began to dissipate. The very heart of Egypt's economy, the marketplace, became nothing more than a tool for imperial exploitation, its traditional systems eroded by Roman demands and policies. The long-term consequences of Egypt's integration into the Roman Empire were clear. The once thriving local economy was overshadowed by the demands of imperial Rome, and Egypt's cultural identity was progressively erased. Though Egypt remained a center of learning and intellectual activity, much of the vibrancy that had characterized the nation's markets, culture, and social life was lost in the wake of Roman domination. This section sets the stage for the final collapse of Egypt's traditional market system and the complete absorption of its economy and culture into the Roman Empire. As we transition into the next chapter, we will explore the long-term implications of these changes, how Egypt's role as a key part of the Roman economic structure eventually led to its decline, both as a cultural and economic force. We will examine how the marketplace, once a reflection of Egypt's power and vibrancy, ultimately became a shadow of its former self. The decline of Egypt's once thriving marketplace was a slow and tragic process, one that unfolded over centuries as the forces of Roman economic policies, political control, and cultural assimilation intensified. By the time of the later Roman Empire, Egypt's local markets had been fully integrated into the imperial economic system, their original character almost completely erased. The vibrant marketplaces that once existed in Alexandria, Thebes, and Memphis, where Egyptian artisans, traders, and farmers freely exchanged goods, had transformed into hollowed-out spaces, offering little more than basic necessities at inflated prices, often controlled by Roman officials or local elites under Roman influence. The marketplace, once a symbol of Egypt's autonomy, culture, and wealth, was now a mere shadow of its former self. Roman policies were the primary drivers of this decline. The imposition of government-controlled taxes and the centralization of grain production under Roman oversight meant that much of Egypt's wealth was siphoned off to support the imperial machine. The once vibrant trade in grain, papyrus, textiles, and other local goods was redirected to feed the Roman Empire, leaving local Egyptians with little to trade or sell. While the Roman state expanded, the Egyptian local economy stagnated. Egyptian merchants, artisans, and traders were effectively sidelined as the empire's economic demands took precedence. The bustling markets, where Egyptians had once engaged in the exchange of goods and ideas, were now stifled by Rome's monopolistic control over trade. The Roman presence in Egypt was not limited to economics, it extended to every aspect of daily life. The growing bureaucracy and military presence drained Egypt's resources, further stifling local entrepreneurship and curbing any semblance of economic independence. The military and Roman officials often occupied key positions in the local economy, diverting resources and labor to support the empire's far-reaching ambitions. This imperial presence was felt not only in the cities but throughout Egypt, with Roman policies dictating what could be traded, how it could be traded, and by whom. The traditional Egyptian market system, once decentralized and diverse, was now fully integrated into Rome's imperial structure. As the Roman Empire tightened its grip on Egypt's economic systems, the once important Egyptian crafts, such as pottery, textiles, and papyrus, slowly faded in importance. These goods, which had once been vital to Egypt's economy and culture, were replaced by Roman imports. Fine Roman glassware, pottery, and textiles began to dominate the markets, while local Egyptian products became less desirable. Egyptian merchants, once central to the Mediterranean trade network, now found themselves marginalized in favor of Roman merchants who controlled the flow of goods. The growing dominance of Christianity in Egypt, especially in the later centuries, added another layer of cultural erosion. Christianity, heavily influenced by Roman imperial practices, gradually displaced Egypt's ancient religious traditions. The temples that had once served as hubs of commerce, culture, and spirituality were abandoned, repurposed, or destroyed. Pagan religious festivals, which had played an important role in the social fabric of Egypt and its marketplace, were replaced by Christian rites. The Egyptian religious system, deeply tied to the market's rhythms, was further undermined by the growing influence of Christianity, which brought with it new customs and beliefs that were at odds with Egypt's ancient traditions. As the cultural and religious systems of Egypt were slowly dismantled, the markets that had once connected people from across Egypt and the Mediterranean lost their relevance. The exchange of goods and ideas, once central to Egypt's identity, became increasingly irrelevant in the face of Roman control. The once vibrant marketplaces, where Egyptians could express their cultural identity through trade, crafts, and religious practices, were now just spaces for the exchange of basic goods, largely controlled by Roman interests. Egyptian markets, once bustling with life and commerce, became mere outposts for the empire's economic needs. Perhaps the most significant symbol of Egypt's economic and cultural decline was the transformation of Alexandria, which had once been the greatest trade hub of the Mediterranean. Under Roman control, Alexandria shifted from a cosmopolitan center of trade to a provincial outpost of the Roman Empire. The city, which had long been a center of intellectual life, culture, and commerce, became more focused on maintaining order and extracting resources for the Roman state. The marketplace in Alexandria, once teeming with exotic goods from across the known world, was now narrowly focused on fulfilling imperial demands. Luxury goods and cultural exchanges became less prominent as Roman goods flooded the city's markets. Alexandria's transition from a symbol of Egyptian power to a Romanized city reflected the broader changes occurring throughout Egypt. The marketplace, once the heart of Egyptian commerce and culture, was no longer a site of Egyptian identity. It had become a tool of Roman control. The decline of Alexandria mirrored the broader collapse of Egypt's local economies. The marketplace, which had once been a vibrant symbol of Egypt's independence and cultural heritage, was now a shadow of its former self, focused on serving the economic needs of Rome rather than the cultural and economic well-being of Egypt's people. What happens when a proud civilization's soul is slowly erased by an imperial power? The answer is tragic. As Egypt's marketplace faded under Roman control, the very heart of its economy was no longer beating. It became a hollow echo of its former self, stripped of its vitality and cultural significance. The goods that once symbolized Egypt's unique contributions to the world, such as papyrus, linen, and fine jewelry, were replaced by Roman imports. The bustling marketplaces that once served as a focal point for Egyptian culture and commerce were now controlled by Roman policies and military presence, with local Egyptians pushed to the margins. The marketplace, once a reflection of Egypt's strength, now symbolized its submission to imperial power. As the heart of Egypt's economy and culture slowly faded, the country's identity as a proud, independent civilization was irrevocably altered. The marketplace that had once been a central part of Egyptian society became an outpost in a vast imperial system. The market, once a dynamic reflection of Egyptian life, was now a tool of imperial exploitation. The decline of Egypt's marketplace represents the broader collapse of Egypt's independence, a loss of its cultural identity that would echo through history. This section sets the stage for the next chapter, where we will explore the legacy of Egypt's marketplace, even as it was transformed under Roman rule. The loss of Egypt's once vibrant market system was not the end of Egypt's cultural influence, but it marked the beginning of the end for Egypt as a powerful and independent force in the ancient world. As we look at the long-term implications of these changes, we will explore how Egypt's legacy lived on through the markets and cultures that were influenced by its once great traditions. Though Egypt's traditional marketplace ultimately crumbled under the weight of Roman domination, its legacy continued to reverberate through history. The decline of Egypt's once thriving market system did not mark the end of its influence. Rather, the commercial practices, cultural exchanges, and economic innovations that Egypt had pioneered left an indelible imprint on later civilizations, shaping the way trade systems would evolve in the Mediterranean world for centuries to come. This section explores how the legacy of Egypt's marketplace, despite its collapse, continued to influence future trade systems and broader cultural dynamics, from Roman times to the Byzantine and Islamic empires. Egypt's agricultural wealth, particularly its grain production, continued to be vital to the Roman Empire's economy, underscoring the lasting importance of Egypt's economic contributions. While Egypt's local markets were slowly suffocated by imperial control, the agricultural backbone of the region was redirected to serve the needs of Rome. Roman grain reserves, supplied by Egypt's fertile lands, were critical to feeding the empire. This connection between Egypt's agriculture and Rome's imperial economy highlighted how Egypt's once localized trade network was now an integral part of a larger global system. Even as the Egyptian marketplace faded, its central role in the empire's supply chain ensured that its economic legacy endured. In addition to its agricultural contributions, Egypt's market system had introduced several key innovations that would continue to shape commerce throughout history. The use of standardized currency, for instance, had its roots in Egypt long before the Romans adopted the practice across the empire. Egypt had long relied on a form of currency for large-scale transactions, and this system was expanded and refined under Roman rule. Similarly, Egypt's early implementation of tax systems and state-controlled trade practices laid the groundwork for later Roman taxation policies and monopolistic trade practices. Though these innovations were absorbed and expanded by Rome, their origins can be traced back to Egypt's market system. The centralized control of trade, the introduction of taxes, and the use of currency were all critical components of Egypt's contributions to the broader economic world. The legacy of Egypt's market system was not confined to its economic practices. The cultural exchanges that took place in Egypt's markets, especially in Alexandria, continued to have a profound impact on the Mediterranean world. Even after the Roman conquest, Alexandria remained a center of intellectual and cultural life, attracting scholars from across the empire. As the traditional marketplace lost its prominence, the exchange of ideas, much like the exchange of goods, continued to flow through Egypt. The blending of Egyptian, Greek, and Roman thought in Alexandria created a unique intellectual environment that would influence later civilizations. Egyptian religious and cultural symbols, which had once flourished in the market spaces, were integrated into Greco-Roman culture, particularly through syncretism, where gods and religious practices from Egypt were merged with Greek and Roman deities. This cross-cultural exchange, originating in the bustling marketplaces of Egypt, would continue to influence Mediterranean societies for centuries. Though the local market system may have collapsed, Egypt's cultural influence was far from over. Egyptian art, craftsmanship, and goods, particularly textiles, jewelry, and papyrus, continued to be highly sought after across the Roman Empire. Egyptian papyrus, for example, remained a prized commodity for centuries after the fall of the traditional marketplace. The skills of Egyptian artisans, particularly in jewelry and textiles, were still highly valued, and many of these goods were traded throughout the Mediterranean world. What was once a local exchange of Egyptian-made products in marketplaces across the region became a broader, though more fragmented, cultural and commercial exchange. Egypt's legacy, while diminished in its traditional form, persisted through these goods, which were still emblematic of the country's long-standing artistic and economic prowess. The long-term influence of Egypt's market system can also be seen in the way its economic practices were absorbed into the broader Mediterranean world. As Egypt's direct role in commerce diminished, its market systems became integrated into the economic structures of later empires, including the Byzantine Empire and the Islamic Caliphates. The Byzantine period, which saw the continuation of Roman political and economic systems, retained much of the Roman influence over Egypt's agriculture and trade. Egypt's role as a vital agricultural hub for the empire persisted, even as its local markets continued to lose their independence. The Byzantine economy, much like the Roman economy before it, was built on agricultural production and trade networks that had been established in Egypt centuries earlier. Similarly, when the Islamic Caliphates rose to prominence in the 7th century CE, Egypt's strategic location and agricultural wealth continued to play a critical role in the broader Mediterranean and Islamic economies. The integration of Egypt into the Islamic world further solidified its position as a key economic and cultural node in the region. The Islamic Caliphates adopted many of the same economic practices that had been established under the Roman and Byzantine empires, including taxation, centralized control of resources, and the use of currency. The legacy of Egypt's marketplace practices, which had once been symbols of local independence and trade, continued to shape the commercial landscape of the Mediterranean, albeit within a new cultural and political framework. While Egypt's marketplace system may have faded into history, its economic and cultural legacy lived on through these later civilizations. The integration of Egyptian agricultural wealth, the spread of its goods, and the exchange of ideas and culture all contributed to the broader economic and intellectual developments of the Roman, Byzantine, and Islamic empires. These legacies are a testament to the enduring influence of Egypt's market system, which laid the groundwork for the trade and commercial practices that shaped the Mediterranean world for centuries to come. What happens when a proud civilization's marketplace, the lifeblood of its economy, fades into the hands of an empire? While Egypt's traditional marketplace may have collapsed, its legacy continued to echo through history. The systems of trade, taxation, and currency that Egypt pioneered served as the foundation for later Mediterranean economies. The intellectual and cultural exchanges that once took place in Egypt's bustling markets continued to influence the civilizations that followed, ensuring that Egypt's contributions to commerce and culture would not be forgotten. As we transition into the next chapter, we will explore how Egypt's eventual transformation into an integral part of the Byzantine and later Islamic worlds mark the final chapter in the story of Egypt's once independent market system. Despite the loss of its traditional marketplace, Egypt's legacy as a center of culture, commerce, and intellectual exchange would continue to shape the broader Mediterranean world. After centuries of foreign rule, Egypt's once dominant marketplace system had been absorbed into the broader economic systems of the Roman Empire, the Byzantine Empire, and the Islamic Caliphates. By the time the Islamic Caliphates rose to power in the 7th century, Egypt's role in global trade had diminished, but with the arrival of a new empire came the possibility of revitalization. This section explores how Egypt's economic role in the Mediterranean world was reinvigorated during the Middle Ages, particularly after the rise of Islam and the expansion of the Islamic Caliphate. Under Islamic rule, Egypt found itself once again at the crossroads of a new empire, one that reconnected Egypt to global trade, but in a new, vibrant way. The Islamic Caliphates, which rose from the 7th century onward, brought with them a vast network of trade routes that spanned from the Iberian Peninsula in the west to India and China in the east. As part of this interconnected network, Egypt was reintegrated into the global trading system. though now as a part of a much larger Islamic world. This new global marketplace allowed Egypt's goods to once again find demand in distant lands. Cities like Cairo, with its bustling souks martics, and Alexandria, with its strategic port on the Mediterranean, once again became vital centers of commerce, playing pivotal roles in the larger Mediterranean economy. Under the rule of the Islamic caliphates, Egypt found itself at the heart of an expansive trading network that linked Europe, Africa, and Asia. The once depressed Egyptian economy, which had languished under Roman and Byzantine domination, was revived as merchants and traders flocked to Egypt's markets, drawn by the flow of goods such as cotton, linen, papyrus, and grain products that had once defined Egypt's commercial significance. The marketplaces in Cairo, particularly along Al-Muiz Street, and in Alexandria's port, became gateways between East and West, with Egyptian goods flowing outward to the broader Islamic world, while exotic goods from Persia, India, China, and sub-Saharan Africa made their way into Egypt's markets. Egyptian artisans, who had once struggled under Roman rule, now found their goods in demand once again. Textiles, perfumes, and even fine papyrus, all staples of Egypt's ancient market economy, flourished in this new globalized commercial environment. This resurgence of Egypt's marketplace under Islamic rule was also facilitated by several key innovations introduced by the Islamic empires, including advancements in banking and trade practices. The introduction of checks and sophisticated banking systems made long-distance trade much more efficient, allowing merchants to conduct business across vast distances with relative ease. The expansion of trade routes, along with the development of institutions like the SAC, Islamic checks, or letters of credit, helped solidify Egypt's position within the larger Islamic world. These innovations, which were pioneered by Islamic traders, played a crucial role in revitalizing Egypt's role as a commercial center. Egyptian merchants, once relegated to the sidelines, once again became central figures in the global marketplace, their goods and services sought after across the Islamic world and beyond. The revived Egyptian market system also benefited from the Islamic emphasis on the promotion of commerce and trade. The Islamic world viewed trade as a noble pursuit, and merchants were held in high regard. This cultural shift encouraged entrepreneurial activity, with Egyptian merchants regaining the independence that had been denied to them during earlier periods of foreign rule. Egyptian cities like Cairo, Alexandria, and Fustat, the precursor to modern Cairo, became major commercial hubs, attracting traders, scholars, and craftsmen from all corners of the Islamic world. The bustling souks, once a symbol of Egyptian autonomy and cultural exchange, were now integral parts of the broader Islamic trading system. These markets, though influenced by Islamic governance, still carried the legacy of Egypt's ancient market practices, such as the organization of trade, the use of currency, and the integration of local goods into global trade. While Egypt's marketplace had been overshadowed by foreign empires in previous centuries, its role in the global economy was once again rejuvenated through the Islamic caliphates. However, this revitalization was not without its challenges. Egypt's status as part of a larger imperial system meant that it was still subject to the whims of its rulers, and much of its wealth continued to be extracted for the benefit of the caliphates. Despite this, Egypt was once again an active participant in the global marketplace, engaging in trade and commerce that spanned continents and cultures. After centuries of decline, Egypt's economic rebirth under the Islamic caliphates marked a new chapter in its history. While its traditional market system may have been transformed and incorporated into a larger empire, Egypt's position as a vital commercial hub within the Islamic world ensured that its legacy would live on. The once proud markets of Egypt, though altered by foreign influences, continued to influence later civilizations, shaping the commercial practices that would dominate the Mediterranean world for centuries. The legacy of Egypt's marketplace system, although diminished, found new life within the broader Islamic world. The return of Egypt to the global trade network was made possible by the innovations and cultural shifts introduced by the Islamic caliphates. Egypt's goods, such as cotton, linen, and perfumes, once again found demand across the Mediterranean and beyond, while its artisans regained prominence in the global marketplace. The bustling souks of Cairo, Alexandria, and Fustat stood as symbols of Egypt's enduring influence, and the commercial systems established in Egypt during this time laid the foundation for future economic developments in the Mediterranean. What happens when a civilization, once proud and independent, finds itself reborn under a new empire? Egypt's market system, although reshaped by Islamic rule, emerged as a key player in the global economy once more. The cultural and economic systems that had defined Egypt for centuries found new life, not as isolated entities, but as integral parts of a far-reaching Islamic world that connected Europe, Africa, and Asia. The rebirth of Egypt's marketplace was a testament to the enduring resilience of the Egyptian spirit and the lasting impact of its ancient trade practices. This section sets the stage for the next chapter, where we will explore the further evolution of Egypt's marketplace system, particularly during the rise of European colonialism and the modernization of Egypt in the 19th and 20th centuries. We will examine how Egypt's once vibrant marketplace continued to evolve, adapting to the changing world around it, and how its legacy continued to shape the economies of both the Islamic world and Europe. The next chapter will delve into the enduring influence of Egypt's market system, tracing its influence through the centuries up to the modern era. The modern era saw a dramatic transformation of Egypt's marketplace system, shaped profoundly by European colonialism in the 19th and early 20th centuries. Under British and French control, Egypt's once diverse and locally controlled market systems were restructured to serve the economic needs of the imperial powers. As Egypt became a critical part of the European capitalist economy, its traditional markets were sidelined in favor of a system that focused on extraction and export. The construction of the Suez Canal, a vital infrastructure project, further integrated Egypt into the global capitalist system, but this integration came at a great cost to local commerce and industries. Under British rule, Egypt's agricultural products, particularly cotton, became central to the British Empire's economic interests. Cotton, the raw material necessary for Europe's burgeoning textile industry, dominated Egypt's agricultural output. The once thriving local markets, where a variety of goods, papyrus, textiles, pottery, and other crafts were exchanged, became focused almost exclusively on cotton production. British policies, designed to support the industrial needs of the empire, dictated that Egypt's resources were exploited to supply European industries. Local industries such as papyrus production, which had been integral to Egypt's economy for millennia, faded into obscurity as the country's agriculture became more and more focused on producing raw materials for export. The shift from a diverse economy to one centered on cotton mirrored the colonial exploitation that had plagued Egypt's marketplace centuries earlier. But this time, the products were different: cotton and other raw materials, rather than the crafts and luxury goods of ancient Egypt. This transformation not only changed the nature of Egypt's marketplaces, but also the fabric of its society. The Egyptian economy, once characterized by localized trade and commerce, was now increasingly dictated by foreign imperial interests. Egyptian farmers, who had once grown a variety of crops for local consumption and trade, found themselves locked into a system that prioritized cotton production for export. This shift undermined local commerce, as fewer resources were available for domestic markets. Local artisans and traders who had once thrived in Egypt's diverse marketplaces were now displaced by the demands of imperial trade routes and cotton production. The traditional Egyptian marketplace, once a place of dynamic exchange, was now a mere cog in the machinery of European capitalism. As Egypt entered the 20th century, a wave of nationalism began to rise, fueled by resentment against British imperial control and the desire to regain autonomy over its economy and markets. The nationalist movement, led by figures like Saad Zaghloul and later Gamal Abdel Nasser, sought to reclaim Egypt's sovereignty and control over its economic systems. As part of the larger struggle for independence, Egyptian leaders recognized that the country's marketplace and industries needed to be freed from the control of foreign powers. In the early 20th century, Egypt saw a series of reforms designed to regain control over its markets and industries. While British controls still loomed large, these efforts reflected a growing desire for economic self-determination. Despite these efforts, however, Egypt's role in global capitalism continued to grow. Cairo, Egypt's capital, became a key financial and trade center in the Arab world, linking the Mediterranean and Middle Eastern economies. The expansion of Egypt's role in global trade was a double-edged sword. On one hand, Egypt was able to play a more active role in the international economy, benefiting from the trade routes and financial connections that flowed through the Suez Canal. On the other hand, Egypt was still constrained by the global economic forces that had been set in motion during the colonial period, with many of its markets still shaped by the demands of foreign interests. In the mid-20th century, under the leadership of President Gamal Abdel Nasser, Egypt embarked on a series of ambitious economic reforms aimed at reversing the legacy of colonialism and modernizing the nation's market system. Nasser's policies were focused on nationalization and industrialization, with the goal of establishing state-controlled industries that could free Egypt from its reliance on foreign powers. The state took control of key sectors of the economy, including agriculture, manufacturing, and trade. This period marked the beginning of a new phase for Egypt's marketplace system, as the government sought to restructure the economy to serve the needs of the Egyptian people rather than foreign interests. The nationalization of industries was a significant step toward reasserting Egypt's control over its economy. Under Nasser, Egypt's government expanded the marketplace into more modern forms, fostering state-owned enterprises and centralized planning. However, the challenge remained. How could Egypt balance state control with the forces of global capitalism? The country was still integrated into the broader capitalist system, and while nationalization offered some degree of independence, Egypt was far from free from the pressures of international trade. The state's control over key industries and markets did allow Egypt to increase its industrial capacity, but it also meant that the country's economy became heavily dependent on state planning and limited private enterprise. Despite Nasser's efforts, Egypt remained caught between the legacy of colonialism and the forces of global capitalism. After Nasser's era, Egypt's economy continued to evolve. In the 1972 under President Anwar Sadat, Egypt began to adopt more market-oriented reforms, including liberalizing trade and inviting foreign investment. This shift further integrated Egypt into the global capitalist economy, opening its markets to the forces of international trade and finance. Though Egypt had regained some autonomy over its markets during Nasser's time, by the late 20th century, the country was once again firmly enmeshed in the global capitalist system, which reflected both the legacy of colonial exploitation and the pressures of modernization in the post-colonial world. After centuries of foreign domination, Egypt found itself trying to reclaim control over its markets once again. But this time, the challenge was different. How could Egypt thrive in a world that was now dominated by European colonial powers and global capitalism? The country's transition from a colonized nation to an active participant in the global economy involved a delicate balancing act, as Egypt sought to redefine its role in the world marketplace, while confronting the long-standing legacy of imperialism. This section sets the stage for the next chapter, which will explore Egypt's current role in the global economy. We'll examine how modern Egypt's marketplace systems continue to carry echoes of their ancient past, even as they have evolved to fit a vastly different global context. The chapter will end by reflecting on how Egypt's past economic systems, though altered by centuries of foreign rule and modern capitalism, still influence the nation's economic future today.